For the first time ever, a direct Iranian attack on Israel. A barrage of drones and missiles fired in retaliation for a strike on the Iranian consulate in Syria. Most were shot down, but the world watches with deepening concern. Who'll be saying what to whom to try and bring calm? This is Inside Story. Hello there, I'm James Bays. Iran warned it would attack Israel in reprisal for the bombing of its consulate in Syria, and 13 days later it did. A huge wave of weapons launched, most shot down by Israel's air defense systems with limited damage or casualties, we're told. Perhaps, as some analysts have said, it's a kind of high-stakes sparring, with Iran choosing not to unleash much greater firepower it has in its arsenal. A choreographed display to flex Iranian military muscle against its arch-enemy, maybe as much for domestic consumption as to send a message to Tel Aviv. However, the diplomatic reverberations are being felt far and wide, with fears about what might happen next. So how serious is the risk of wider conflict, and what's being done to prevent that? And is the US President Joe Biden the only person who can now rein in Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu? We'll be exploring what might happen next with our panel of guests in a few moments. But first, this report from Lina Abu Akleh.
The shockwaves from Iran's attack are reverberating worldwide, with many political leaders alarmed by the barrage of drones and missiles. It's the first time Iranian weapons have directly targeted Israel from Iran. Israel said air defense systems intercepted most of them. Tehran had vowed revenge after Revolutionary Guard commanders were killed in the bombing of the Iranian consulate in Syria 2 weeks ago. The missile barrage increases international worries of sparking a wider regional conflict, but Iranian military leaders sought to draw a line under the latest hostilities.
We see this operation as completed and successful, and there is no intention to continue it, and it's over from our perspective. But if the Zionist regime does anything against us, either inside our soil or anywhere in Syria or other countries, our next operation will be much bigger. If the US gets involved in any action against us, none of its bases will remain safe in the region.
But words from the top in Israel will do little to ease fears of more conflict to come.
This campaign is not over yet. We need to remain prepared and attentive to the IDF's and Home Front Command's instructions, and to prepare for any scenario. At the same time, we blocked the first wave of attacks, and we did it with great success.
US President Joe Biden has again vowed to defend Israel, but wants to avoid open conflict with Iran. Since Israel's genocidal war in Gaza began in October, killing and wounding more than 100,000 Palestinians, fears have grown that the violence could explode into a wider war. International diplomats are working frantically to avoid further military action that could have devastating regional and global consequences. Lina Abu Akleh, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Well, we're going to define the significance of this escalation in the Iran-Israel conflict with our panel today. In Tehran, Mohammad Marandi is a professor at the University of Tehran, and he's advised the Iranian negotiating team at international nuclear talks. In London, Yossi Mekelberg is an associate fellow at the British think tank Chatham House. And in Washington, D.C., Akbar Shahid Ahmed is senior diplomatic correspondent at HuffPost. He's covered US foreign policy since the Obama administration. Thank you, all three of you, for joining us today. Mohammed, let me start with you. We have had literally decades of hostility and proxy attacks between Israel and Iran. But what has changed in recent hours? Would you say that Israel and Iran are now at war?
Well, first of all, the strikes last night against the Israeli regime were very devastating. The Iranians severely damaged 2 military bases. And the propaganda that we're seeing 24 hours a day, literally now, in the Western media about how little damage was cause is absolute nonsense. The Iranians sent many very cheap drones and old missiles as decoys, maybe a couple of $1 million, and the Israelis spent $1.3 billion to down them. And then the main missiles all got through and struck the military bases. And if the Israelis are so confident about themselves, then I guess today they can take international reporters to see the two bases for themselves. But beyond that, we have to remember that Iran has shown strategic patience for years. And the Israelis carried out assassinations in Iran years past and sabotage. When that failed, they started to assassinate Iranian officers in Syria who were fighting ISIS and Al-Qaeda and their affiliates who were being supported by the Israelis, among others, alongside the Golan Heights. And during the last 6 months, when Iran has been supporting Gaza and the resistance and been opposing the genocide, the Israelis murdered a number of officers of Iran in Syria. And Iran did not retaliate, at least directly, because Iran wanted to keep the focus in the past on the fight against ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and now the focus on Gaza, because the Americans and the Israelis and the West want to change the narrative. But since the Israeli regime struck the Iranian embassy and the US, Britain, and France and the UN Security Council refused not only to punish the Israeli regime, but to condemn it, the Iranians were obviously forced to punish the regime. And this has changed the equation. This is the big change.
Okay,
From now
let me bring in
whenever-
Yossi and ask how it's changed the equation. People have talked about this for a long time as a shadow war. Is it now a hot war?
Yeah, it was a direct attack. Let me start what I actually agree with the previous speaker, is that Iran showed strategic patience for many years, and that's, fighting through proxies actually serves the Iranian regime. But it definitely didn't serve it last night. And I don't know where this information about hitting our 90% of the around 350 drones, cruise missile, ballistic missiles were intercepted and probably didn't cause much damage. Sadly, it's injured badly one young girl. And I think in this sense, the question is what happens next. But it changed the parameters of this conflict from a shadow war, for what Israel calls war between wars, into a direct one. Now, Iran says on the one hand, this is a closed chapter. We want to move on from there. Israel said it would retaliate. I think in this sense it's better for Israel not to retaliate, because what happened yesterday, after Israel actually experienced months of criticism from its closest allies for the way it conducts the war and the unacceptable way it conducts the war in Gaza, actually Iran and Tehran managed yesterday to unite the United States, some countries in the region, Europe, in defending in Israel. So I'm not so sure in what sense this was a strategic success for Iran. But at the same time, there are pressures within the Israeli government, to retaliate. But as it stands, and as you alluded earlier, the cards are with President Biden to ensure that there is no further escalation.
Akbar, how worried are they in DC? Because, of course, there's a nuclear dimension to this. Israel doesn't talk about it, but we all know it's a nuclear power. Iran has a nuclear program, and most experts say if they wanted to develop a nuclear device, the breakout time is just a matter of days now.
Absolutely, that's a huge fear. And I think there's an awareness for the Biden administration in particular, which did not pursue, the Obama-era nuclear deal that Donald Trump torpedoed. The Biden administration knows that their choices have brought Iran much closer to nuclear capacity than ever before. And they know Israel right now has a huge incentive to begin a big war. I think for US officials, what they're thinking right now is, how do we get Israel to, as Yossi said, see it as logical and beneficial to not escalate. However, what we know from 6 months of this conflict now in Gaza is that this government in Israel in particular is not being driven so much by necessarily rationality, strategy, achieving its actual war aims. It's being driven really by the political calculations of Prime Minister Netanyahu and, importantly, those around him seeking to succeed him, right? So you showed a clip of Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, very much seen as someone trying to out-hawk Netanyahu. Right, you've now seen Benny Gantz, the kind of DC preferred alternative to Netanyahu, also come out and say, we want to hit Iran hard. Now, what that means for the US is, even if they're in a scenario where the Biden administration can avoid an Israeli escalation against Iran, I think that they then feel they lose political capital to stop Israel from doing other things they don't want Israel to do. So that means the operation in Rafah, in Gaza, which the US is extremely worried about what that would look like and what that would mean for Palestinians, for international opinion against Israel. That also means Lebanon, right? That's a place where Israel could say, okay, if you're not going to let us hit back at Iran in some huge dramatic way, we have been kind of chomping at the bit to go into Lebanon. And I think there's a real fear among US officials that the leverage to stop either Rafah or Lebanon is now quite low on the US side, especially because President Biden chose in this moment to revert to what's called his bear hug strategy with Israel. So demonstrating overwhelming military, diplomatic, rhetorical support for Israel in a bid to kind of gain American influence. That hasn't worked in Gaza. So I don't know if it'll work for the Americans going forward.
Looking at the scale of the attacks, Mohammed, you are telling us things that are not what we are hearing from the Americans and the Israelis. You say that two bases were hit and severely hit. We've got no pictures of that. We've got no reporters to go to the scene. And yet the narrative that's coming out from the US side, let me quote you, the National Security Council spokesman of the US, Admiral John Kirby, an incredible military achievement by Israel is just an extraordinary example of military superiority. What do you say to that? And, you know, isn't this damaging for Israel's, as for Iran's military reputation in the region and damaging for domestically for Iran?
Are these the same Americans who are saying we have no evidence of genocide in Gaza? Or are these the same Americans who are saying that our intelligence says that there were tunnels under Al-Shifa Hospital? Or that the resistance, they bombed their own hospitals? I think that's the same intelligence agency, so I wouldn't take it too seriously.
Okay, Mohammed, you made some specific claims which I haven't seen elsewhere before this programme. Yeah. Certainly the Israelis are saying that a base called Nevatim, which is in the south of Israel, in the desert, that suffered some minor damage. Just to be clear for us, where is the other base that Iran says it's severely damaged?
First of all, it's very surprising that in this base in southern Israel, only a small little girl was severely wounded. I wonder what she was doing there. But I think all you have to do is ask the Israelis to let you see the base and take a comprehensive tour of the base, and I'm sure all is well. But if really indeed the Israeli regime was successful, then why are the Americans so worried about the expansion of the conflict?
Okay, Mohammed, sorry to interrupt, Mohammed, but just to be clear, because you made an allegation about two bases, can you name the other base for us, please?
Yes, it's an intelligence gathering base, which the Israelis are using against the resistance in the north and in particular in Syria. So I think, this 99% stuff reminds me of the elections of these governments that are controlled by the United States, these presidents, which all get 99% of the vote. The fact is that the Israeli regime last night was humiliated, and the Iranian hit them back. And when your guest goes and says that Arab governments or what their position may be, we have to look at what people on the streets are saying, not at what governments are saying. In fact, if the greater the gap between the governments and the people in the region when it comes to Israel, the worse it is for those governments. So when, for example, the Jordanians are seen to be siding with the Israeli regime, that's the Jordanian government. That's not the Jordanian public. Let's separate these two. But again, as I said, if the Iranian offensive capabilities are so weak, then the United States should encourage the Israelis to attack Iran again. But I think the Americans know that if Israel strikes Iran again, the response will become even more harsh this time around.
Benny Gantz, one of the key members of the war cabinet, Yossi, is saying that Israel will extract a price in a time and manner of Israel's choosing. Do you think it plays into this in any way, into the calculations of exactly what scale Israel's response is, the fact that this attack by Iran was very clearly telegraphed in advance? It took place at a time when both Israel and the US were on the highest state of alert, and the fact that there were no deaths.
Well, there was an element of a theater in all of this, where we could watch at home and actually know exactly when the drones and the ballistic missile and the cruise missiles were launched. And what we hear now, that basically there are two Iranian narratives that contradict each other, but one for domestic consumption and one for international and strategic reason. For domestic reason, it's presented as a great success, and there is some story about Israeli bases badly hurt, though you can imagine that satellite imagery by now would have exposed something like this and it be revealed in public. So this probably is a kind of a narrative developed domestically in Iran. On the other hand, it was almost obvious that Iran didn't want to hurt Israel too much because they understand the consequences of it, and they didn't want to push either Israel, the United States, the region into a cascade war. So between the strategic and the need to appease some domestic pressures, there are now some not only paradoxes, but there are tension. And what Benny Gantz, which is one of the more responsible members of this cabinet, says, you know, Israel will choose its time and the manner of retaliation. In other words, Israel doesn't need to retaliate right now because there was no major danger and major threat or major damage to Israel. Let's remind ourselves, actually, the damage was caused 2 weeks ago, and everyone expected and accepted that Iran, to a certain degree, has the right to respond to that. The question is the time, the scope, and the place. And now we know how it happened, then everyone can move on. And again, Iran, in many ways, by fighting through proxies, was better off. And while Israel has been criticized for the last six months and being isolated, right now, Iran actually made Israel standing internationally in a way better stand.
Akbar, we seem to have evidence that the US did get a direct warning, and certainly the Iranian side are saying that they did warn the US. The evidence I have, for example, the US President Joe Biden was at his home in Delaware, and then he hurried back to the White House because he knew this was coming. As a diplomatic correspondent for your organization, how much knowledge do you have of what's been going on behind the scenes in recent hours and days?
Yeah, there are two channels between the US and Iran to kind of pass these messages of deconfliction or any other kind of important message they need to pass, right? So one is through the Swiss, who are sort of the guardian of any diplomatic relationship where there isn't a tie between two countries. And then Brett McGurk, who is President Biden's quite controversial Middle East advisor, but very influential. Brett McGurk has been running his own kind of channel in recent months in Oman, an Arab state that does maintain some degree of relations with Iran. So there are these channels, and certainly it's understood in DC that Tehran does not want to escalate in some huge way right now, and also perhaps does not have the bandwidth to do so. I mean, given the regional situation where, yes, Arab states are very conscious of their population being subject to Palestinians. They're also very worried about Iran. I mean, that's indisputable. There's a lot there, right? And then there's Iran's own domestic situation coming now almost 2 years after mass protests over the killing of a civilian woman. So there's a lot of reasons why Iran may not want to escalate right now. Washington doesn't want to escalate. But I think the wild card here remains that Israeli cabinet, right? And I think one thing I just want to highlight is that in this moment of bluster, in this moment where we're still talking incredibly, right, after escalations on both sides, the Israeli attack in Damascus, the Iranian attack today from Iranian soil into Israel, we're still talking about further escalations. Okay, now who's going to punch back in a bigger, scarier way? And that's exactly the kind of talk that a lot of US officials don't want to see. And conversely, at the political level in the US, we see President Biden and a lot of lawmakers, especially Republicans, saying the time is right to send $14 billion more weapons to Israel, right? So that's the stalled military aid package that Biden has wanted since the start of the Gaza war. So while there's a lot of hesitation, there's also a lot of political maneuvering, including in DC and in Israel, to escalate further and to arm Israel more, which leads to greater risk.
Mohammed, let me ask you about diplomacy that might be going on behind the scenes. You've heard Brett McGurk maybe talking, Akbar is saying, directly to the Iranians. What's your understanding of any direct contacts? Because, of course, Brett McGurk was part of the Obama administration, as are many of the officials in the Biden administration. Bill Burns, the CIA director, he was involved in nuclear diplomacy. Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, he previously was involved in negotiations with the Iranians. You know all this well, Mohammed, because you were an advisor at one point to the Iran nuclear team. Are there direct talks between the two sides?
No, there are no direct talks between Iran and the United States, and we have indirect communications between the two countries that have been utilized for years now. And of course, the Iranians have sent messages to the United States, and the United States has sent messages to Iran. And the United States knows quite well that escalation is not something that's in the interest of the United States. If the United States were to get involved, these very same missiles and drones that are highly capable will destroy U.S. bases in the Persian Gulf region and then across the region. And those countries that host those bases will be seen as complicit. And that would bring about massive destruction, and it will destroy the global economy because energy prices will go through the roof. So the Americans, they have enough sane people left in Washington, I think, that would understand that they can say the propaganda about how all the drones and missiles were stopped and all that, and how in Gaza Israel is winning, and how in Lebanon they're winning, and the Americans are winning everywhere, and how Russian drones and missiles are all shot down. They're also being shot down, 99% of them in Ukraine. But the Americans are losing across the board, and the West is on the decline. And so the Americans
let me bring in Yossi on this, because it's pretty clear the US, I think all of you are saying this, wants to draw a line under this and stop any further escalation, and that seems to be Iran's position too. But Yossi, we've seen President Biden in the last 6 months give unconditional support to Israel to defend itself. We've seen President Biden send a naval armada to the region. We've seen him provide diplomatic cover for Israel at the United Nations. And we've seen him continue, despite all the deaths of civilians, to send weapons to Israel. And yet, whenever Biden has said, show restraint, respect my red lines, Netanyahu does not listen to him. So what sway does Joe Biden have over Israel and the current Israeli government right now?
And I think we need to differentiate between the U.S. policy when it comes to Gaza, and I think we should have seen a way more proactive President Biden in stopping the war, the ceasefire, humanitarian ceasefire, and allowing more humanitarian aid entering, the release of the hostages, and so on and so forth. There was not enough pressure on Netanyahu. And differentiates from the attack last night that I think the United States and the other allies were right in stopping these income drones and missiles. But when it comes to the United States, it has all the cards when it comes to Israel. If it wants, it can actually put enough pressure on Israel. Again, not necessarily to do exactly what Washington wants, but enough sometimes to save Israel from itself. And the way, and the thing I agree with I think a lot of what is, I disagree, because actually Iran is supporting all the wrong causes right now in the Middle East and also in Russia in its war with Ukraine. But when it comes to Gaza, Israel is not winning the war in Gaza. It's making only make it worse for the Palestinians and for Israel. And if it's the role of the United States actually to help Israel to get beyond the war, to think about the day after in Gaza, and try to build also a new security architecture in the Middle East, which will include peace with the Palestinians, more inclusive, including of Iran, but at the same to look at Iran as not an adventurous force that destabilizes the region.
So you say that the US has all the cards, Yossi, and has not been prepared to use them until now. Akbar, we heard Mohammed talk about potential economic meltdown globally if this was to expand into an all-out war between the two countries. Well, just 7 months away, you've got a US presidential election. Do you think President Biden is prepared to use all these cards now?
I think it's indisputable that if a major Middle East conflagration occurs, which would, as Mohammed mentioned, include Iranian or proxy strikes on US bases, probably in the Persian Gulf, probably shutting down shipping routes and energy exports, that would be a huge blow to American global influence, to President Biden's re-election prospects. I will say the US knows it has the leverage, right? So I think one factor in this conflict that hasn't gotten enough attention is that in a couple of spaces, President Biden has used that leverage. So on October 10th, for instance, we know from the Wall Street Journal that Israel was ready to strike Hezbollah in Lebanon, right? They had made a decision. They wanted to expand the war. President Biden had a 45-minute phone call with Netanyahu and said, this is not happening. What I think is so striking about that is that means Biden and his team have known since October 10th that it will take one phone call to stop Israeli actions, whether it's in Palestine, in Gaza, in the West Bank, where they say they're quite concerned, and also regionally. They haven't made that choice broadly. I think that calculation could shift as we get closer to the election. And I do think, zooming out to the broader picture, yes, President Biden is thinking about his re-election in November, but he and his team, this has been one of the handicaps of the Middle East approach, unfortunately, but it remains one of their focuses. They see themselves as these adults in the room, right? Not just dealing with the conflicts of today, but setting the stage for US relevance on the world stage in the future. So they are very much thinking about the Pacific, they're thinking about the war in Ukraine and European security. And from that point of view, they do not want some destabilizing factor, some destabilizing conflict in the Middle East right now that upsets the relationships they're building in the Pacific, right, and upsets energy security there. They do not want some kind of shift of Arab states towards Russia, feeling that Russia is more successful in Ukraine. So they're very conscious of those factors as well as they're making their decisions on that.
OK. Thank you very much to all three of you, our guests today, Mohammed Marandi, Yossi Mekelberg and Akbar Shahid Ahmed. As ever, Al Jazeera aims to give you the most comprehensive coverage of what's going on in the region. And you can always find context and analysis on our website, aljazeera.com. Your views are much appreciated too. You can contribute on our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or find us on X, where we're at AJ Inside Story. From all the team here in Doha, please stay safe. I'm James Bays, and I'll see you back here very soon. Bye-bye for now.